Welcome to another episode of 10-Minute Land Surveyor. I'm Dave Woolley. I recently saw a clip on YouTube of a singer by the name of Billie Eilish. She was receiving an award at the Grammys, and she made reference to the stolen land of the United States, which she has a right to do.
No one is illegal on stolen land. No one is illegal on stolen land.
Prior to Billie Eilish's statements that prompted this video, I had heard her name, but I was unfamiliar with her music, and I took a little bit of time to listen to a few songs, and she's quite talented. The history of the United States is actually not a Grammy slogan. It's layered sovereignty that involves wars, treaties, alliances, failures, collapse, and succession. I occasionally go to public meetings here in California, and it's not uncommon for them to have a land acknowledgement. It's really interesting in that land acknowledgement doesn't affect title, doesn't affect sovereignty. I think it'd be pretty hard-pressed to actually attribute the land to the individual tribes that are often mentioned. Today I'm going to cover about 400 years of history in about 20 minutes. I would recommend that you pick out a few key principles and do a little additional research. It's very interesting. We're all familiar with the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock. This is in the early 1600s, well before we were a nation. Now, the people that arrived at Plymouth Rock, they weren't colonists. They were actually refugees. You can do some research as to why they're refugees by today's standards. Now, they were greeted by American natives. Now, there weren't just a group of natives. There were literally hundreds of tribes. Some of them were very political and organized, such as the Iroquois Confederacy, and then others were more nomadic. But the ones that they met immediately were highly organized as series of tribes. And they had something called the Great Law of Peace, which was a constitutional governance by which they maintained peace and they had interaction within themselves. And to the west, you had Comanches, which occupied large swaths of land, and they were very organized. You had the Cherokee, which had their own constitution. Now, each one of these nations had their version of diplomacy. They had war, they had alliances, and they had trade. They were very much political actors within the landscape. At this time, there was something called the doctrine of discovery, which meant that if you discovered that land, you laid claim to it, and you assumed title to that land. The primary actors were Britain, France, and Spain. Then you had the Portuguese working their way back and forth. Modern title, as we understand it, was covered in 1823 by the United States Supreme Court. Understand that this is about 40 years after we became a nation. The case is Johnson v. Emmentosh. In that decision, Chief Justice John Marshall acknowledged that the Native American Indians occupied rightfully the soil. They also acknowledged that they were their own political sovereign entity. This remains true today. In that same decision, they determined that the federal government owned the title to the land. And the reason they did that is they had Native Americans selling property to private individuals, and there was already transactions starting to happen. And in those transactions, they didn't want to basically have the same land sold twice. And this is the basis of our land law to this day. This does not mean that the federal government stole the land, because there were various treaties throughout history in which these transactions were negotiated. It wasn't as though it's yours, now it's mine. These were negotiated, and they were negotiated between tribes, because you have to understand that many of the tribes were nomadic through the plains areas, and they didn't have boundaries or recognized boundaries. They actually fought each other for the soil. To understand the history of America, we're going to start at the 7-Year War, or the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War wasn't French fighting Indians. The French-Indian War was actually the British fighting the French. And you have to understand that the British and the French each had alliances with these independent confederacies of the natives. They worked together. So on the British side, you had the Iroquois Confederacy. And on the French side, you had the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Ottawa. They all worked together. They participated. When these alliances were formed between the British and the natives and the French and the natives, it wasn't based on a manipulation. It was based on who they thought was going to win, what kind of trade routes were going to be opened up, and the friendly relationship that they held with each other for a balance of power. because at this point, the Iroquois Confederacy was a powerhouse of its own. Ultimately, the British beat the French, and that's how they acquired the land east of the Mississippi to the Atlantic. Now, this war ends in 1763, and in the prosecution of that war, Britain almost went broke. And what do they start doing? They start taxing the American colonies. Now, you can see where this is going. The British are taxing. Think Boston Tea Party. Think Stamp Act. This directly led to the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to wrap this up. The 7-Year War was between Britain and France, between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Algonquin. And what it was is it was sovereign to sovereign, and that's how the land changed hands. And you have to understand that the natives were very much a part of this, and they were their own political and their own military force. Empire to empire. Okay, so at the end of the 7-Year War, there was a Native American chief by the name of Pontiac, and he held considerable power, and he wanted no business with the British. He wanted his own territory, and he declared war on the British. And in that war, they had what they called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Therefore, the Native Americans had their own territory under Pontiac. Unfortunately for Pontiac, years later, he was assassinated by his own people. If you have the least bit of interest in history, I would recommend that you research Pontiac. It's not just a town in Michigan or a pretty cool car. Now, every American should be familiar with the Revolutionary War, particularly Nathan Hale. I regret that I only have but one life to live for my country. You should read about Nathan Hale. He's a very interesting guy. Probably died when he was 22, 23 years old. Now I just reminded almost every American how the land east of the Mississippi came into being the United States. So you ask yourself, well, what about west of the Mississippi? Well, we'll start first immediately west of the Mississippi. That land belonged to France through the doctrine of the discovery. And I'm going to work my way west. Napoleon is fighting wars, and he needs capital. So what does he do? He sells to the United States the Louisiana Purchase, which was French land through the doctrine of discovery. The Louisiana Purchase went from Louisiana, encompassed most of Colorado, Oklahoma, Michigan, all the way up to Montana. That was in 1803. Next, the United States acquires Florida from Spain. Now, it's very important that you understand this land was purchased from France, purchased from Spain, not stolen, bought. Now, if you have an argument that somebody stole something through the doctrine of discovery, it's actually not with an American. Go take your beef up with Spain. Go take your beef up with the French. I don't particularly care for either one of them. The next purchase included modern-day Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State. That land was purchased from the British. Now, that land was purchased in 1846, almost 75 years after we became a nation. So take your stolen land beef up with the Brits. Now, let's talk about Texas. The Texans didn't want to be under rule by the Mexicans, and they fought their own war. Now, this does not involve Americans or the United States per se. There were Americans in Texas, but Texas became its own sovereign nation in 1836. Now, the land was occupied by several tribes. A lot of it was held by Comanches, who killed both the Mexicans and the Americans that ventured into Texas, and they were the dominant force there. So after Texas becomes its own country in 1836, Texas is its own sovereign nation, and they petitioned the United States to become a state within the United States. And the Mexicans don't want that. I guess they want Texas to be a state within Mexico. Fair enough. So you have the Mexican-American War. Now, in this war, the United States wins the war. But understand that the United States Army went to Mexico City, which is about 600 miles south of the Texas border today. They were stealing land. They could have taken all of northern Mexico and stopped at Mexico City. Instead, they decided to create the border at the Rio Grande. This was determined by treaty. Everybody agreed to these borders. Now, everybody, which would include the United States, the Mexicans, and the Texans, which included the Native Americans, agreed to the borders being on the Rio Grande. Okay, we've talked about everything except for the southwestern United States, which would include California, Nevada, parts of Arizona, Utah. Now, this was under Mexican rule, but you have to understand that the Mexican government had only won their independence from Spain about 25 years earlier. But prior to that, Spain owned what is today Mexico. Now, if you read the history of the Mexicans that occupied the northern parts of California, this is prior to the gold rush, folks like John Fremont and Kit Carson were fighting with them. And the Mexicans considered that part of California or that outpost assignment as being their own Siberia. Nobody really wanted to be there. Now, you have to understand that the tribes in Southern California were mostly conquered by the Spanish and through the mission system. And for the most part, they lived peaceably together. In Northern California, that became something separate. And the reason is the gold rush of 1849. You had Modocs and Klamath and several other tribes in Northern California that were suddenly impacted by hundreds of thousands of people. Naturally, conflict would occur, and there were plenty of wars, plenty of atrocities to go around it. And I would recommend looking at the Modoc Wars to understand some of the things that happened. And to throw Kit Carson's name out there, he was part of a massacre. Apparently, they went and killed a bunch of Klamath when they should have been Modoc, or Modoc when they should have been Klamath. Okay, now to wrap this up, the Southwest United States was claimed by Spain, not the United States. And through succession and through wars and through treaties, it was acquired by Mexico. Again, another sovereign nation, nothing to do with the United States. The United States was a neighbor to the Mexicans that owned California. As part of that treaty, the United States acquired what is now California, Utah, and Nevada. And that was through a treaty, and there was money paid, as with all treaties. Let's talk about the western United States, everything lying west of the Mississippi. There's a couple of key things to remember is this was a frontier. There was very little law involved. There were people scattering all about. This was not white people killing Native Americans. This was anybody killing anybody. You had people fighting for resources. And that was migrants, that was Native Americans, and that was everybody between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Let's take a break at approximately 1850. Let's talk about the land west of the Mississippi. You have to understand that this land was a frontier. It was wild. It was a very violent place, and it had to do with survival in the most basic terms and the gathering of resources. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of murder. There was a lot of disease. And it was not exclusive of white people killing Native Americans. If you want to talk about what escalated the violence, you can talk about the discovery of gold. 1849, 1850 California saw an influx of hundreds of thousands of people hoping to strike it rich. Naturally, you had conflict. There was a lot of murder. If you look at the murder rate in the United States at that time, it was off the charts. Now, this gold rush created a lot of violence. Now, that's important, and we're going to touch on that again later. Now, after the end of the Civil War in 1865, they were able to reallocate soldiers to the West to establish some form of law. Now, it was after the Civil War that the Indian Wars escalated, and this was largely due to occupancy. Now, there were chiefs, such as Red Cloud, that actually won several wars and settled in a treaty as to which land belonged to who. It wasn't actually stolen. It was fought for, and they agreed on the settlement. Now, it's important to understand that not every tribe in the area was a party to the treaty, and not every treaty was honored. In fact, the United States broke several treaties. One treaty that was broken was the Laramie Treaty of 1868. I'm very familiar with this particular region of the United States. This is the Black Hills in South Dakota, extends over into Wyoming. The Black Hills, in native speak, Pahasapa, belong to several bands of the Sioux tribe. Now, this was a sacred place, and so in that treaty of 1868, they said, you can have the Black Hills, we don't need it, and everything was hunky-dory. Now, when George Armstrong Custer passed through French Creek in the southern Black Hills, modern-day Custer today, they discovered gold. And just like 1849 California, everything went sideways. The U.S. government could not control the people going into the hills. People were there to find gold, and in doing so, they were occupying the land that had been given to the Native Americans in the 1868 treaty. Well, of course, they didn't like that, so they went to war. At that point, you had Native Americans rightfully declaring war for a violation of the treaty, but they were completely overrun. And you have to understand that it was a lawless place at that time. If you look up the history of Deadwood, South Dakota, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, it was a lawless place. And the Indians couldn't do anything about it. The federal government couldn't do anything about it. Finally, in 1877, the United States took the Black Hills from the Indians. Before you scream, whoa, that's stolen land. Yes and no. So although the land was taken, they were paid for the land, $17 million in 1877, but the money was held in a trust, and the natives refused to accept the money to this day. That trust is expected to be in excess of $2 billion. So you're like, whoa, why wouldn't they take $2 billion? Well, when you divide it up by the number of Native Americans that would be entitled to that money, it comes out to about $10,000 apiece. Frankly, if I was a Sioux native and you were going to give me $10,000 to give away the sacred land of my ancestors, I probably wouldn't take the money just out of principle because it would close the case forever. It wouldn't change my life to have that. I know I'm never going to get that land back. I know that that treaty was broken. We were compensated. We haven't accepted the compensation. We're not going to get the land back. But I don't want to betray my ancestors for $10,000. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty familiar with this history. And what happened is they were fighting with the Native Americans and the tribes had banded together. And you're familiar with Little Bighorn. You might be familiar with the massacre at Wounded Knee. And it was a very violent place again. But ultimately what happened is they killed the buffalo. And by destroying the buffalo herds, that starved the Native Americans and it made them acquiesce to going to the reservation. And the reservations that they were confined to exist today. There's 7 of them in South Dakota. I've been to Pine Ridge and Rosebud many, many times, Lower Brule and Standing Rock. And there are few places in this nation where the people are more destitute. Now, 1900. The states that we recognize today existed from coast to coast, and the violent century from 1800 to 1900 was behind us. There were no more territorial wars. By 1900, there were only 237,000 Native Americans in the United States. Many of them had died due to disease or a lack of an immunity to the disease. And the same was true in Mexico with Mayans and Incas and Aztecs. The diseases that were brought over, not by Americans, they were brought over by the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and the British. That's what killed them. So when you talk about stolen land, it's a very complex, a very layered system. If you want to point fingers at who stole land, you should look at Britain, France, Spain, maybe some of the Portuguese. The Americans are the ones who created the free land. You are not an American by virtue of what color or what religion you had. The founding fathers made sure that that was true. You are an American by living under the organized government of the United States. The same United States that fought wars and signed treaties and purchased the land that is currently occupied by the states that make up the United States. So the story of the ownership of the United States is a very layered system of wars, treaties, broken treaties, occupation. I wouldn't get too upset if a homeschooled 24-year-old singer stands up and says that we're living on stolen ground.
No one is illegal on stolen land.
The history of the United States, as with all history, has a lot of nuances and a lot of complexities. And we could be grateful that it wasn't Genghis Khan that occupied the United States first. Every American has a duty to understand this history. It's very nuanced, it's very complex, and there is violence, there is injustice, as is the nature of man, as is the nature of the history of the world. To know our history is to know what it is to be an American. And we should be grateful to every American for making it what it is today. Anybody that occupied the land in 1900, coast to coast, Canada to Mexico, was an American. It was not uniquely European. And we can thank every one of those Americans for our sovereign nation. Now, if you just feel as though somebody was wronged or you have to point a finger at somebody, I would suggest that you point your finger at Britain, France, Spain. And I'm not talking about modern day Britain, Spain, and France. I'm talking about the Britain, Spain, and France of 300 years ago. That's who your beef is with. Technically, let's say they stole the land. We as Americans purchased, fought for, and settled this land. And so if you have a problem, it shouldn't be with an American. If you're going to take American history lessons and land acquisition lessons from a creative artist, that's on you. I would recommend that you offer some grace and give her a break. Okay, now, the people that were clapping like seals in the audience, that's a different program. They panned the audience, and I didn't recognize any of these folks. But if you want to protest something, or if you want to be offended, you should be offended at the American education system. If you can find one redeemable thing about this nation, you can thank an American. Thank you, and have a nice day.